Digital dividends, strengthening the analog foundation of the digital revolution. Policy implications, making the Internet universal, affordable, open, and safe, with Tim Kelly.
I'm going to be talking today about the policy chapter of the World Development Report 2016, which looks at how to make the Internet affordable, universal, open, and safe. We argue in the report that there are three essential ingredients that any country requires to achieve an internet which is universal, affordable, open and safe. The first key ingredient is market competition. The second is private sector participation. And the third is effective light touch regulation of the industry. The cover photograph that we used for the World Development Report really illustrates these 3 points. The photograph shows migrants, economic migrants, working in Djibouti who are originally from Somalia. They are photographed late at night, trying to capture the mobile signal that's coming from Somalia. Now, the reason they are doing that is because the signal from Somalia, or the service in Somalia, is actually much cheaper than the service which is available in Djibouti. Although Djibouti has a level of wealth per capita which is perhaps 3 or 4 times that of Somalia and has enjoyed relative stability over the last few years while Somalia has been in civil war. Nevertheless, because Djibouti has still retained a monopoly, a state-owned monopoly, the price of telecommunication services there is quite prohibitive. So these users from Somalia prefer to go out late at night when they can capture the signal coming across the estuary from Somalia. But there are equally problems on the Somali side. Somalia, because of its history, has no effective regulation. It still has no Communications Act, for instance, and therefore operators, privately owned operators within Somalia, are unable to negotiate mobile roaming licenses with other countries, with other operators. So for that reason, you can't actually use a Somali mobile in Djibouti. So this picture really captures the 3 essential ingredients of competition, private sector participation, and effective regulation, which make digital technologies work. In the report, we talk about digital dividends, the benefit that digital technologies can bring to individual consumers, to firms, and to governments in terms of more efficient delivery of services. But we conclude in the report that the full benefits of digital technologies are not really being seen. And one of the key reasons for that is there remains a significant digital divide between information haves and information have-nots. Across the world, there are at least 500 million people that actually live outside of areas that are served by mobile coverage. So there's at least 500 million people that still have no real access to telecommunications services. There's at least 4 billion people that have no access to internet, and probably as many as 6 billion whose access to internet is neither always on nor affordable. So the real challenge is to bring down that number so that the internet becomes universal, affordable, open and safe. In the report, we looked at some of the factors which differentiate between information haves and have-nots. Generally speaking, if you live in an urban area, a city, you are much more likely to have good, affordable access to the internet than if you live in a rural area. Similarly, if you're a man, you're more likely to have good access to the internet than if you're a woman. Now, that gap has really narrowed over time, and some countries around the world, it's actually the opposite, that women have better access to the internet, or you're more likely to be a power user of the internet if you're female than if you're male. A third factor that differentiates between information haves and information have-nots is the level of education. And some countries have really put an emphasis on digital literacy skills. Singapore, for instance, has done very well in developing a new cadre of super internet users. Now, all of these 3 factors, whether it be geography, whether it be gender, whether it be level of education, You could apply them to almost any technology, whether it be ownership of cars, ownership of TVs, ownership of dishwashers even, because they all have a single underlying variable, and that's wealth. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to be an internet user. So the challenge, therefore, is really to overcome these differences. And we see certainly some countries that we highlight in the report that have been very successful in extending the benefits of internet technologies to all of their inhabitants. We're working in Tanzania, for instance, with the government to bring mobile coverage to areas of the country that have previously been underserved. And together with the government of Tanzania, we have extended digital coverage to an additional 2.5 million people through the RCIP, Regional Communications Infrastructure Programme in Tanzania. There is a fourth factor, though, which differentiates between information haves and information have-nots, and that is age. We find consistently in all of the countries that we work with that you're much more likely to have access to the internet and to be able to use the internet effectively if you're a younger person than you're an older person. And I think this will become an increasing problem as we move forward, as the populations of particularly developed countries age. Now, a number of governments have taken steps to begin to address that issue. In Korea, for instance, they've developed internet clubs for senior citizens where they provide basic skills, basic digital literacy skills that enable senior citizens, for instance, to communicate more effectively using video technologies with their families. And I think that will be an increasing challenge in developing countries. For the moment, developing countries are really benefiting from the demographic dividend, the fact that they have relatively young populations. But as those populations mature and become older, there will be a real challenge to address the issue of training in digital literacy skills for older citizens to avoid a new kind of digital divide emerging. In the report, we develop a policy framework for thinking about how governments can develop policies which are appropriate to the internet value chain, if you like. We argue that there are four parts to the internet value chain. The first mile, where the internet first arrives in a country, the middle mile, the last mile, where it reaches end users, and the so-called invisible mile. At the level of the first mile, what's important is liberalisation of cable landing stations and also opening up the market for satellite. In the middle mile, it's competition between backbone providers and between mobile network operators, which is important, as well as having private sector participation. Setting up an internet exchange point is also a very good way of ensuring that there's interconnection between internet service providers within the country. The last mile is perhaps the biggest challenge, especially in rural areas. And there we need a combination of policy-based solutions such as competition, but also technology solutions using new technologies such as TV white spaces, WiMAX, Wi-Fi, etc., to make sure that internet is universally available and affordable. The fourth component, which we call the invisible mile, is composed of those essential elements for providing internet which are non-visible. Things like the spectrum, things like cybersecurity, things like data protection and privacy. Over time, these kind of issues will become much more important. Indeed, in the final chapter, final part of the report, we talk about the demand side for internet. The supply side policies are relatively simple. As I mentioned earlier, we need competition, we need private sector participation, we need effective light touch regulation. For countries that have those three ingredients in place, the chances are that they'll have a relatively successful ICT industry. They've developed what we call an enabling environment. But the challenges associated with the demand side of the internet are much more engaging and much more difficult to resolve. In the United States, for instance, the elections that were held in 2016 were dominated by issues around cybersecurity, around data protection, and around fake news. All of these are important issues about the demand side of the internet. And as we move forward, it will be the demand side policy issues which come to dominate as we begin to solve the supply side issues.